What if I told you there's a streaming service that has been quietly building up in the shadows, unnoticed, and is currently beating all its competition, like Disney+, Max, Amazon Prime, etc. combined? Regardless of the metric, whether we're talking about number of users, profits, growth, watch time, or even cultural impact, this streaming system is winning. And not only that, these other streaming systems have unknowingly been helping to strengthen and build their biggest competitor and potentially their downfall. The name of this mega streaming system? YouTube. But why did this happen? And what lesson can we learn from this story? Today, we're going to explore the 3 main reasons why this happened and what the future holds for these streaming systems. The first reason has to do with an age gap. The second, with a lack of understanding of how the internet works by these companies. And the third, which I would argue is the most important, is one that, once you know about it, you'll understand how all these companies think and operate, what they are really trying to achieve, how this affects your daily life by keeping you poor, and how you can use this information to your benefit. And maybe, for once, prevent these companies from taking advantage of us, the little guys. Believe me, I am not exaggerating with this last point. Let's start with the age gap. Maybe you don't think of YouTube as a streaming system, but essentially that's what it is, a website where we can watch videos online. Sure, it might be free, but so are many others like Pluto or Tubi. Currently, YouTube makes up nearly 10% of all viewership on connected and traditional TVs in the US, while Netflix, the biggest paid streaming service, ranked second, claiming only 7.6% of viewership. This becomes even more relevant when you discover that of all streaming systems, YouTube is the only one that consistently generates money, with the exception of Netflix, which has only recently been able to turn a profit. And that's not counting the millions and millions of dollars invested in it that it still owes. If you didn't know, streaming doesn't make money. The only two that have managed to generate profits are these two, probably because they were among the first and have both been around for almost 2 decades. But then a question arises. If streaming not only doesn't generate money, but is a market where you have to invest and spend a lot of money, why is it that suddenly all companies want to create their streaming service? Well, this has 2 reasons. The first has to do with how most big companies operate currently, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But now I want to focus on the second, which has to do with an age gap that has occurred in the market, partly caused by what we've discussed. And for this, I'll use the example of Disney. You know how recently Disney, with some exceptions, has had flop after flop after flop? Many have pointed out the quality of these productions, as well as the existence of Disney+, where after a few months you could see their new movies for a fraction of the price, making going to the cinema seem unnecessary. And while I consider these points to have merit and to be partially true, I'd like to propose another possible answer. Did you know that today, 1 in every 4 people who go to Disney is an adult going by themselves or accompanied only by other adults? No kids? It's true. Disney currently has a kid crisis, and it's not hard to see why. When I was a kid, Disney Channel was the best. Hannah Montana, High School Musical, Phineas and Ferb, all very successful Disney Channel movies and TV shows with a big cultural impact. Going back to High School Musical, the premiere of its second film was, at the time, the biggest premiere in cable history, not just for kids shows, but for all of cable television. Back then, it was inescapable. It was such a juggernaut that its last movie wasn't for television, but for cinemas, and adjusted for inflation, it grossed almost $360 million, more than $1/3 billion. And that's without counting merchandising and other sources of income. All of this was only possible because in the 2010s, Disney Channel was a top 10 network in the world. Now it's in 80th place. Kids simply aren't watching Disney, but you know what they are watching? YouTube. Things like kmowm, which consistently passes the billion view mark, or Mr. Beast. We usually talk about an age gap between boomers who refuse to leave TV and the rest of the generations. But in reality, it's an age gap between 3 generations. Boomers with their TV programs, millennials, and Gen Z who find a middle ground consuming streaming services like Netflix or Hulu. And Gen Alpha, aka iPad kids, whose main and often only source of video entertainment is YouTube, or failing that, TikTok. Although TikTok is technically a streaming system, it's a product that's in a totally different category for many reasons that I won't get into, because they're not relevant to this discussion. For many of these kids, if it's not on YouTube, it doesn't exist, so they don't generate the same affinity and love for the Disney brand as in past generations. That's why probably 1/4 of the time invested in Disney Plus is people watching Bluey, an Australian program which Disney has the license for outside of Australia, but which isn't actually a Disney brand. And guess where you can find multiple episodes of Bluey? Exactly, on YouTube. This obsession of the new generations has reached such an absurd point that we have registered cases of children in countries like the US who start developing an English accent due to Peppa Pig or an Australian one due to Bluey. I've even seen stories of children who, before going to sleep, tell their parents like and subscribe as a way of saying goodnight. That's marketing and customer loyalty that money cannot buy. All of this wouldn't have been possible if the creators of Bluey didn't upload several of their episodes to YouTube, and all the other studios are doing the same, uploading episodes or clips of their most popular programs with a high budget and production values beyond the budget of any YouTube video, even one from Mr. Beast, and they are doing all this for free. Which brings me to the second point. The second point is about a lack of understanding of how the internet works by these companies. Why are companies giving YouTube much of their expensive and valuable content for free, something they don't do with other streaming systems, even when this creates losses of billions of dollars? The answer is simple. First, it generates extra money in the short term. But second, because YouTube is so big and has so much power in current pop culture, after years of attacking and demonizing it as they saw it as a piracy center, studios began to use it as a source of advertising, seeing it as a lesser platform, something not to be afraid of. This is the same way studios used to see Netflix initially before it grew and became the monster it is today, which is funny now. You see news about how Amazon is going to invest $100 million to get MrBeast to make shows for them. Finally, it seems that the big heads are realizing the value of YouTube content creators, hiring them to do what they do best, instead of forcing them into their series or movies as they used to do. But this only reveals another advantage that YouTube has and separates it from all the other big streaming systems. Amazon has to spend $100 million to have a MrBeast show, but YouTube gets MrBeast to make them hundreds of videos for free. This is only possible due to its business model. In contrast with all the big streaming systems, YouTube is the only one that doesn't produce its own content, nor does it rely on buying licenses from other producers. YouTube is a platform where we, regular people, upload the content we want, when we want. YouTube functions as a middleman and only takes a portion of the money your video generates in advertisement. This is a more scalable model than the subscription model that most streaming systems have. That's why these systems are changing and starting to implement a hybrid model of tiers, where some users will receive ads while others won't. This makes sense. There's a reason why HBO, a pay channel, despite having series like Game of Thrones that pulled in millions and was the most watched program on television in its time, was never the channel that produced the most money. But unfortunately for streaming systems that aren't YouTube, this model based on ads is very difficult for them to succeed with, as it goes against the model of how the internet works. If they don't change this, it's more than certain that most will disappear. But to explain why, we first have to understand why streaming services like Netflix or Disney Plus opted to use a subscription service instead of one based on ads, which is how most television has been functioning for decades. But why, if they had been using the ad-based business model for decades, which is more scalable than a subscription one, did these streaming systems opt to use a paid subscription system? Well, I'm glad you asked. Any successful startup or innovation, especially in technology, follows these stages on this graph. We start with the innovators, which is the company in question that brings the new technology and are the only ones using it. Then we have the early adopters, who tend to be bloggers, press, or enthusiasts of the topic in question. These are the ones who will create the initial buzz for the product. After that, we have the early majority, late majority, and laggards, who would be the general public. Now, how a product manages to go from early adopters to the early and late majority is simple, and I'm sure you'll recognize it. It all starts with a vlogger, or someone from the press, trying the product, talking about how incredible it is and how it's going to change the world. However, due to price or other limitations, it's not accessible to the general public. Over time, these limitations are reduced, and eventually, the product is refined and made accessible to the general public, although it may lose some of the features that made it so attractive to early adopters to ensure it can be delivered to the most people. In the end, the general public adopts it as a common use item or service. Think about how Starbucks initially positioned itself as an exclusive place with high-quality coffee and a cozy atmosphere, to then become a place that sells prepackaged products and highly sweetened drinks. Or how Uber was this super revolutionary app that was super convenient, which gave you a premium experience for less than a taxi would cost you. But now that it's common use and everyone has it, it no longer gives that premium service and is often the most expensive option. Or, for the case that concerns us today, how Netflix started as this super economical option that gave you access to hundreds of titles, but now raises prices, doesn't let you share passwords, and has a less diverse catalog than it had before. What I'm getting at is that streaming systems changed from the paid subscription model without ads to a paid one with ads, because initially they needed early adopters. But now that streaming is the name of the game and everyone knows and uses it, well, they can afford to give a lower quality product because they no longer need to create the same buzz in the same way they did before, just like Uber, just like Starbucks. But a problem these streaming companies are running into, and that they didn't see coming, was that instead of adopting a model that looked a little more like YouTube's, maybe not in its entirety, but incorporating ideas from it, they basically wanted to bring television to the internet. This is difficult to work because, as I said, the internet and television models are different. In general terms, there are two types of marketing: inbound and outbound. Inbound is when you attract the customer to you, and outbound is when you go to the customer. Now, I know it can be a bit confusing at first, but look at it this way. Imagine you set up a lemonade stand. Inbound marketing would be going to the town square, putting your stand there with a banner that says "Delicious Lemonade." You stay where you are, and apart from this simple action, you don't do anything to attract more customers. You trust that your banner is attractive enough to bring in customers. In contrast, in this example, you would be using outbound marketing if instead of using a banner, you went to knock on each of your neighbor's doors to announce your lemonade. The reality is that most businesses tend to use a combination of both, and it's important to understand that neither is necessarily better than the other. It all depends on your resources and needs, and what is outbound and inbound isn't necessarily so strict, and sometimes works more like a spectrum. But in general, and to not drag this out too much, inbound works better if you have few resources and/or are looking for a very specific niche audience based on the idea that they will eventually find you. Meanwhile, outbound works better when you have more resources and want something to be seen by as many people as possible, hoping that in that group there will be a few who are interested in what you have to say or show. To get to the point I want to make more quickly, television is outbound, as it's the television networks that curate the content and show it to you without much input from your part. This contrasts with the internet, where the whole point is that someone makes the product, things, or content super specific to your needs or tastes, and you search for them, not so much the other way around. In other words, television is outbound, and the internet is inbound. Something like summoning souls Vault, a YouTube channel that makes documentaries about video game speedruns, or Defunctland, which is mainly dedicated to making documentaries about things related to amusement parks and has a nearly 2-hour video about the history of queues at Disney, would immediately be kicked out of any studio if given as a content proposal for what they currently do. But on the internet, they get millions of views on each of their videos and have a vivid fan base, and they manage to do this on a shoestring budget. To finish this point, television with ads is based on investing a lot of money to make content that attracts the largest number of people, comprised of very different individuals with different needs and tastes. Meanwhile, people who are successful on the internet base their strategy on spending little money to attract, sometimes many people, but more often than not, a small group of very similar people with similar tastes and needs. Or for another analogy, and again, none of this is so strict, the internet has targeted content, but even then, this tends to be tied to your search history. So in a way, it's something you would have searched for, or that you've already searched for in some manner. This is why I say this separation is a spectrum, but I just want you to remember the following analogy. Television is like buying a yacht and moving along the entire coast to hunt a specific type of fish using a net. Sure, you're going to catch the type of fish you're looking for, but you're also going to catch many other things you don't want or need while spending a lot of money. Meanwhile, the internet, and by extension YouTube, is like renting a small boat and waiting calmly at a point with a fishing rod and specific bait to get the fish you want. Both can work, neither is perfect. And of course, one can learn from the other and incorporate ideas, but let's be honest. If you're used to using yachts, why would you change to a small boat? This brings me to my third and final point. If we've already seen that the traditional television model doesn't work so well on the internet, why do studios insist so much on forcing this on us? Well, that's easy. And it's not just that they don't want to leave their yachts. It has to do with how modern business works, at least in places like America and Europe, and how rich people use these businesses to access tools that you don't have access to make themselves richer at the cost of keeping you poorer. For this next part, I'm going to ask you to remember this quote from Charlie Munger, the vice president of Berkshire Hathaway, one of the biggest conglomerates in the world that mainly deals with buying and selling stocks. Show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. Since I was a teenager, throughout my business career at university, and until a year ago during my MBA, I asked myself the following question. Why do these big companies care so much about making so much money? And I know it might sound like a dumb question, but let me explain. Stick with me a little bit. There's a point to all this. If I or your neighbor open a business, we care that the business generates profits because ultimately we will keep the money it produces. And if we get tired of managing it, or simply for any reason we have to let it go, we can sell it and keep the money. But this doesn't happen with most large companies, as they are listed on the stock market and usually belong to their shareholders, who tend to be large corporations, multi-millionaires, or regular people like you and me, people who have shares of the company in question, a share being a small part of the company that's for sale. But here's where my doubt came in. If I have one share or 40% of the shares, why should I care if the company generates more or less profit? After all, I won't receive any of those profits, and in the few cases where I do, like with Disney for example, this usually represents a small amount that doesn't even cover 3% of what it cost me to acquire the share, so it becomes practically irrelevant. It's not like you can suddenly get fed up and say, I'm out, and take a part of the company with you, because yes, technically you own a part of the company, but you can't do much with it. It's not like buying a share allows you to walk into Facebook's headquarters or Apple's offices and take a computer just because you want to. So why buy a share? And more importantly, why do big companies care about generating profits if their owners or shareholders won't receive this money, but rather it's money that will stay with the company, not them? For them, it should make no difference whether the company generates $1 billion or just a penny. As long as the company exists, it should be all the same to them. Heck, even if the company is losing money and generating nothing, it should be all the same to shareholders, right? Yes, companies like Uber or Spotify are famous for losing millions every year. Or in Uber's case, it wasn't until this year, after almost 15 years, that it finally showed positive numbers. Of course, if you don't count the billions that other companies invested in it and that it still hasn't compensated for. Well, this is simple. What these investors care about is the value of their shares, not the business. The business is just a means to an end. That's why a company can generate no money. But as long as it generates growth, and that is positively reflected in its stock, its investors will be happy as they'll see their money grow. But that's in theory, because in reality it doesn't usually work that easily. And the more you investigate, the darker and frankly more frustrating this whole matter becomes. These shares allow them access to financial tools that you and I don't have access to, and very likely never will. And that's what I want to focus on. But to understand why this happens, we need to travel back almost 30 years to the mid-90s and look at the story of the worst corporate acquisition in US history. In the 90s, the internet was this new hot stuff, kinda like AI is now in 2024. It was full of possibilities. The things you could potentially do with it seemed infinite. Everything you could imagine could be improved through the use of the internet. Sales, education, entertainment, everything. And the biggest internet provider in the US was AOL. And it was based on a business model where they charged you for internet use, not by month or year, but by the hour. Quickly, in less than 7 years, it went from being worth $0 in 1992 to more than $160 billion in 2000, or almost $300 billion in 2024 money. It was one of the highest valued companies in history. So they decided to go on a shopping spree, and they offered to buy Time Warner that same year for $182 billion. Now, before the deal, Time Warner was valued at around $60 $60 billion, which was around what it was making. This makes sense. You are valued at the amount of money that you make. So AOL paid what is known as a premium, which is an extra amount paid basically to sweeten the deal. So Time Warner, which was a company that was actually making a pretty decent amount of money, wasn't worth that much in the grand scheme of things, almost half of what AOL was worth. Do you want to know how much money AOL was making? The more than $160 billion company, one of the biggest companies in the world and in history at the time, was making $7 billion. That's it. It sounds ridiculous because it is. So instead of Time Warner saying, I am a real business that makes actual money, I should buy you, they said, really? Okay. Now this deal was done with a lot of debt, but mainly with stock. AOL bought all of Time Warner with almost pure AOL stock, resulting in Time Warner staying and controlling 45% of the company. The reasoning of Time Warner's CEO was as follows.
80% of the cash flow of this combined company will come from your company, and yet your shareholders will own only 45%. Why were you willing to sign off on the deal?
Oh, well, pretty clearly, if you looked at last Friday, the market cap of AOL was twice the size of Time Warner. I've made a judgment, which I believe to be correct, that going forward, the Time Warner shareholders will be much better off owning 45% of AOL Time Warner than 100% of Time Warner.
Now, do you want to know what happened? The following year after the purchase, 2001, this new technology called broadband internet was created, essentially making charging for internet by the hour, which was AOL's main business, a thing of the past. And a year after the acquisition of Time Warner, this happened to AOL's value. Yikes. Now, to return to the topic I was discussing before starting this story, I want us to look at this interview with Time Warner's CEO from years later on the subject. I'd like to forget it. I almost didn't do this interview because I didn't want to dig it up again. Let it pass into history. The Time Warner AOL merger should pass into history like the Vietnam War and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. It's one of the biggest disasters that have occurred to our country. I lost 80% of my worth and subsequently lost my job. We looked it up to see if I was the biggest loser of all time because I lost about $8 billion. What I want you to ask yourself is the following. Why the heck didn't he sell as soon as he saw that the ship was sinking? Well, this could be for a variety of reasons. The contract that both companies signed might have prohibited selling before a set date. It could be seen as insider trading, which is illegal, or maybe because doing so would look bad and cause the shares he had to be worth less, as it would appear that he doesn't trust his own company and would also create more supply in the market, but not more demand. But then if you find yourself in a situation similar to this CEO's, what should you do that he didn't? The correct answer is, paradoxically, to get into debt. And this is a trick that rich people use. Essentially, what they do is the following. They go to a bank, ask for money, giving as collateral some asset, in this case their shares. This means that if they don't pay the bank what they owe, the bank will take the shares of the person requesting the loan. Obviously, the bank will charge interest to the person requesting a loan, and thus you can essentially have access to the money your shares will produce without having to give up your ownership over them. And how will our millionaire pay back that loan later? Easy. They'll just have to ask for another loan from another bank using the same system. That's simple and tax-free. Because I did mention it's tax-free, right? Yes, because unlike when you sell a stock and have to pay taxes that will go to roads, schools, and public health programs, things that nobody needs, here, since you technically didn't sell anything, it's tax-free. But that's not all. Instead of paying 10, 20, 30% or whatever amount of the money you generated that you'd have to pay in taxes, you might now only have to pay 2 or 3% in interest to the bank. But what would happen if the stock you have grows 5%? Well, my friend, in that case, you manage to generate money while spending your money, potentially investing in something else that generates more money for you, and repeating this whole cycle again. The phrase, you have to spend money to make money, was never truer. And obviously, if a normal person like you and I try it, it wouldn't work out the same way for us, due to all the advantages these millionaires have, like being able to spend insane amounts of money without worrying because they have much more, or a bank giving them great facilities when lending them money at potentially lower interest rates than what they offered you or me, because otherwise, these millionaires could easily go to another bank, so they have a lot of leeway. By the way, when you see that a celebrity or a millionaire bought this or that thing in cash, it was most likely using this method, because nobody has that much money in cash on hand. In this case, cash means a direct line of credit, and we return to that phrase I mentioned a few minutes ago. Show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. If the incentive isn't in making a healthy company that generates money, or even making one that lasts long, as you don't need that to make a quick buck a lot of time, where is it? The incentive is in inflating the value of a stock as much as possible, and at its peak, selling it to the sucker next door, or increasing the company's stock as much as possible to keep getting tax-free loans, essentially stealing money that should go to things that would help our entire society, children, the less fortunate, and those who need it. That's why you shouldn't be surprised when you see news like Robert Allen Chapman, Disney's former CEO, premiering several Disney movies on Disney Plus during 2020 and 2021, or HBO Max, now just Max, suddenly removing 100 titles from its platform overnight. Allegedly, this wasn't because it was best for the streaming system, but to be able to put in their accounting books that those movies were partially Disney Plus expenses and not from Disney's movie-making division. vision, saving their necks in the process. As it doesn't look the same when a movie that cost hundreds of millions to make from one of the largest studios in the world loses millions at the box office. As opposed to saying that not everything was lost because that was part of the plan, guys. We expected to generate little money there, since the movie's real mission was to increase their streaming numbers for, pumping the value of the stock. Or in Max's case, allegedly, again because I don't want to be sued, you removed all that content to artificially reduce your expenses, since you won't have to pay royalties or various payments to the people who produce the thing that makes you earn millions of dollars and allows you to live your eccentric millionaire life. Meanwhile, this creatives are a lot of times struggling to make ends meet. Now, it's not like your company generating money doesn't help its valuation, but when you analyze streaming systems, and generally many companies, but for what concerns the scope of this video, streaming systems, you'll see that they make many decisions thinking short-term and only about how they should increase their stock value without focusing much on earnings. That's why most CEOs' pay is tied to stock value, because that's what investors want to incentivize. Stock value, often without asking if it will be the most beneficial for small investors who have a few shares to try to earn some extra money, or the company's workers whose lives depend on the company's well-being, who live paycheck to paycheck, who probably are going to get laid off as a consequences of the company wretched decisions, not like them who are in a safer position, and that in the case of the company going bankrupt, well, they have 20 others and millions of dollars to fall back on. That's why overnight they all created their streaming systems, getting into debt up to their eyeballs, kicking and screaming, instead of doing it slowly but steadily, which is what Netflix and YouTube have done, the only two profitable ones, especially YouTube. But what can you do to solve this? Well, no matter where you are, something I mentioned likely applies to your country. In that case, I recommend you talk to your politicians and push them to pass regulations to prevent this. Pay attention to what these companies are doing, be careful when you buy or sell stock, and make sure you're not the sucker next door. When choosing a new job or deciding to leave your current one, analyze all the information, consider what I discussed in this video, and see if it applies. I won't tell you what decision to make. First, because I am not an expert and can't do that. And second, because only you can and should make that decision. However, I believe it's good to have the full picture, or at least as much of it as possible. Although I'm not a fan of Google, and I have many complaints about how it and YouTube operate, one thing I can give the latter is that in an industry where the average CEO only lasts 5 years, thus having the incentive to make the stock grow as much as possible in the shortest time possible in order to receive the biggest payday possible, YouTube had the same CEO for almost half of its history. Again, I don't agree with many decisions Google and YouTube make, and I'm not saying they're completely free from making the same mistakes and doing similar things that other businesses do, but at least in this aspect, I can say that from a business point of view, it seems this incentive hasn't completely derailed them, at least not yet, and that's why YouTube is winning for now.